My name is Emma Whitaker, and for almost a decade, I was the person everyone called when things fell apart. A client threatening to walk? They sent me. A project running weeks behind? I stayed until it was fixed. A whole department falling apart at the seams? I was the one at my desk at midnight, untangling the mess everyone else had left behind. I wasn't loud. I wasn't the type to wave my hand in meetings or put my name on every email chain. I just worked. I believed what most people grow up believing, that if you do your job well and show up every single day, the right people will eventually notice. For years, it seemed like that rule was true. My reviews were strong. My teams trusted me. Executives nodded when my name came up. I had no reason to think anything was working against me. I was wrong. The director position opened on a Tuesday morning. I remember because I was already at my desk when the internal posting went live, and 3 different coworkers stopped by before 9 o'clock to tell me the role had my name written all over it. By the end of the week, 2 senior managers had quietly told me to expect a conversation with HR soon. One of them, a man who had been at the company nearly 20 years, patted my shoulder in the hallway and said, "It's yours, Emma. Everyone already knows it." I had been leading cross-functional teams for 6 years at that point. I had managed budgets that most directors never touched. The biggest client relationships in the department ran through me. My supervisor, a woman named Yvonne Keller, had signed off on all of it, praising every result, every quarter, without exception. So I waited. Confident. Patient. Ready. The announcement came on a Friday afternoon. I was called into a conference room I had used dozens of times before. Yvonne was already seated when I walked in, her hands folded on the table, her expression carefully flat. She told me the company had made its decision. She said the leadership team had given it serious thought. She said these processes were always difficult. Then she told me I wasn't getting the promotion. I remember the hum of the air conditioning. I remember the water glass in front of me that I never touched. I sat very still and asked her to explain. She smiled, the polite kind, the rehearsed kind, and said the company felt I was not quite ready. Then she added something else. Something slower, quieter, and much more deliberate. Asterisk, some people just aren't cut out for leadership, Emma. That's not a failure. It's simply the truth. Asterisk. I didn't react. I thanked her and walked out. The new director was announced that same afternoon. His name was Jason Briggs. He had been with the company for 3 years. I had trained him on 2 of the projects currently listed on his resume. He was polite, reasonably smart, and almost entirely inexperienced at the level the director role required. He was also Yvonne's personal mentee. She had lunch with him every other week. She had recommended him for 2 stretch assignments in the past year, both of which I had quietly helped him complete without any credit attached to my name. When the announcement was made in the all-hands meeting, the room went strange. People shifted in their seats. A few looked at me with an expression I recognized, the kind that mixes sympathy with discomfort, because no one knows what to say when something unfair happens right in front of them. Yvonne stood beside Jason and started clapping. Her eyes found mine across the room for just a moment. She wasn't nervous. 2 days after the announcement, a coworker named Ben pulled me aside near the copy room. He had been at the company longer than I had and understood the internal politics better than most. He looked uncomfortable, like he had been debating whether to say anything at all. He told me that before the promotion decision was finalized, Yvonne had met privately with 2 members of the leadership team. He didn't know everything said in those meetings, but he had heard something secondhand from someone who was there. Yvonne had told them I wasn't ready to manage people at the director level. She said I had trouble building trust with senior stakeholders. She said she had concerns about my executive presence. Ben looked at me carefully after he said it. He knew, and I knew, that none of those things had ever appeared anywhere in writing. Not once in 6 years of reviews. Not one documented concern. Not one formal conversation. She had said it quietly, privately, where there was no record. 3 months after Jason took the role, I saved the company's largest client contract almost entirely on my own. The situation had collapsed fast. A logistics breakdown caused a cascade of missed deliveries, and the client was threatening to end a relationship worth several $1 million annually. Our department was in chaos. Jason didn't know the client's history. He didn't know the contract terms well enough to negotiate. He didn't know which internal teams to call or in what order. So I handled it. I worked 4 consecutive late nights. I rebuilt the delivery timeline from scratch, reached out to the right vendors, and personally got on a call with the client's operations director to walk him through the recovery plan step by step. The client stayed. At the next executive meeting, Yvonne presented the outcome as a departmental success. She outlined the strategy in careful detail. She used language directly from my own summary report. She never mentioned my name once. Afterward, Yvonne found me near my desk and offered what I think she believed was a kind word. She said, "The team really pulled together on that one." I looked at her and waited. She smiled and added, "That's what good teamwork looks like, Emma. Success belongs to everyone." That evening, she sent a department-wide email thanking Jason for his steady leadership through the client crisis. She listed him by name twice. She did not list me. I forwarded the email to my personal account and saved it without knowing exactly why. Something in me had quietly shifted. I had spent 6 years trusting the system, trusting the process, trusting that results would speak for themselves. But results only speak when someone in power is willing to listen. Yvonne had decided, somewhere along the way, that she would never listen to mine. Within the next year, 2 of the strongest people on my team resigned. The first was a woman named Priya Ose, a senior analyst who had grown more in 2 years under my mentorship than in the 5 years before she joined our team. The second was a project coordinator named Felix Drum, who had turned down a competing offer specifically to stay and work alongside me. Both left without saying much publicly. But Priya called me the night before her last day. She said that during a routine conversation with someone in HR, Yvonne had described me as difficult to work with and said I had a pattern of creating tension on my teams. There was nothing formal. No complaint filed. No investigation launched. Just a quiet word planted carefully in the right ear. I thank Priya for telling me. I hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. Without anything written down, there was nothing I could do. The second promotion cycle arrived 18 months after the first. I had rebuilt quietly after the disappointment. I took on more responsibility, led 2 major initiatives that directly increased department revenue, and said nothing public about what Ben or Priya had told me. I kept my head down. I kept producing. When a new director opening was announced, my manager's manager pulled me aside and told me my name was at the top of the list. 2 weeks later, Yvonne called me into her office and told me the role was going to someone else again. But this time she didn't dress it up with careful language or practice sympathy. She leaned back in her chair, studied me for a moment, and said plainly, "Emma, have you considered whether this company is really the right fit for you?" There was no warmth in it. It wasn't advice. It was a signal. She wanted me gone. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam anything or fire off an angry email or pull Ben aside to vent about what had just happened. I walked back to my desk, opened a new browser tab, and started updating my resume. I had made a decision. Not from defeat, from clarity. I finally understood that no amount of excellent work was going to override what Yvonne had already decided about me. She had done it quietly, carefully, and without leaving fingerprints. She had used soft, invisible language, not quite ready, leadership presence, team dynamics, to build a ceiling above my head that no performance review could ever crack. So I would leave. Professionally. Cleanly. I would take everything I had built inside that company and use it to build something better somewhere else. Before I closed the browser, I printed my updated resume and tucked it into my bag. When I handed in my resignation 2 weeks later, Yvonne accepted it with the same expression she used for everything. Composed, unreadable, and just slightly satisfied underneath the surface. She said all the right things. She wished me well. She said the department would miss my contributions. Then, right at the end of the conversation, she couldn't quite help herself. She looked at me with something that tried to pass for genuine concern and said, "Smaller companies can be a better fit for people who need more room to grow at their own pace." She meant it to sting. She meant it to attach itself to my next steps like a weight, to make me second-guess every decision on the road ahead. Instead, it did something completely different. It made everything simple. It removed the last trace of doubt I had about leaving. I smiled at her, picked up my bag, and walked out the door without looking back. The company I joined was called Ridgepoint Solutions, and the most accurate word to describe it when I arrived was chaotic. 3 of their largest clients were close to walking. Their operations infrastructure had been built in pieces over several years and never properly connected. The leadership team was smart and genuinely motivated, but had no clear picture of what to prioritize or where the bleeding was worst. I knew exactly where to start. Within 60 days, I had mapped every breakdown in their client delivery process, identified the 2 internal systems causing the most damage, and started rebuilding the operational framework from the ground up. People at Ridgepoint spoke to me differently than people at my old company ever had. They listened. They pushed back sometimes, which I actually respected, but they never dismissed an idea before testing it. For the first time in years, I felt like the ceiling above me was completely gone. 6 months after I joined, I led the recovery of a contract worth just under $10 million. The client had 1 foot out the door when I took over the account. They had a list of 23 unresolved issues and a meeting already scheduled with a competing firm. I worked through that list item by item. I personally handled the conversations that needed the most careful attention, and I rebuilt their confidence through actions rather than reassurances. When the client signed a 2-year extension, RCO, a man named Warren Aldis stood up at the company all-hands meeting and said my name clearly, loudly, and more than once. He said, "Emma Whitaker rebuilt this relationship from the ground up, and this company would look very different today without her." I had to look down at the table for a moment. Not from embarrassment. From something older and quieter than that. The 3 years that followed were the fastest of my professional life. The systems I had designed in my first year became the foundation everything else was built on. We brought on new enterprise clients. We expanded into 2 new service areas. Revenue grew at a pace that attracted serious investor attention for the first time in the company's history. I was promoted twice, first to Vice President of Operations, then to Chief Operating Officer. Neither promotion was something I campaigned for. Both were offered directly, without hesitation. Around the same time, I began hearing things about my old company through former colleagues. Not catastrophic things at first, just the slow, steady accumulation of worrying details. Clients quietly moving elsewhere. Restructuring efforts that never seemed to fix what they were supposed to fix. A company culture that had grown tighter and more guarded under leadership that never changed its ways. At an industry conference during my 3rd year at Ridgepoint, I ran into Ben, the same coworker who had warned me years earlier about what Yvonne was saying in those private meetings. He looked tired. He told me the company had lost 3 major accounts in less than 6 months. Leadership had responded with a round of aggressive structural changes that most of the experienced staff believed were badly designed and poorly timed. Morale was low. Good people were leaving. He told me Yvonne was still there. Still in the same role. Still running things the same way she always had. He shook his head and said quietly, "You got out at exactly the right time." I ordered us both coffee and asked him to keep in touch. On the train ride home, I thought about all of it, not with bitterness, but with a calm kind of distance. The past had become a story I no longer lived inside. I was somewhere else now. Somewhere better. Warren announced his retirement on a quiet Wednesday morning. He gathered the leadership team in the main conference room and told us directly, without much ceremony, that he had decided the time was right. He had taken Ridgepoint from a struggling idea into a real, growing company. He was proud of it. He wanted to leave while it was still moving forward. Then he looked at me. He said the board had discussed it at length. He said they were fully aligned. He said there was only one name that made clear sense to everyone in the room. He asked me to take over as CEO. I sat with that for a long moment. I thought about the conference room 6 years earlier, the water glass I never touched, the polished smile Yvonne gave me when she told me I wasn't cut out for leadership. I looked at Warren and said yes. In my first quarter as CEO, we launched a significant expansion that required filling several key roles across the organization. The most important was Senior Director of Operations, a position reporting directly to me, responsible for holding the operational core of the company together through our next phase of growth. HR built the hiring process carefully. We were specific. Someone with real experience managing complex, fast-moving operations. Someone who understood how to build teams and keep them together. Someone with genuine leadership instincts, not just a title to go with them. Applications came in steadily over several weeks. I reviewed resumes each morning before the rest of the day took over. Most candidates were strong. A few were exceptional. Some were easy to pass on quickly. And then one morning I opened a new batch, scanned down the page, and went completely still. The name at the top of the resume was Yvonne Keller. I read it twice. Then I set the page down and looked out the window for a moment. Her experience was listed in clean, confident bullet points. Years of management, department oversight, operational leadership. On paper, she looked like a reasonable candidate. If I had never met her, I might have moved her to the next round without hesitation. I called HR later that afternoon and asked about her current situation. They told me her company had gone through a serious restructuring several months earlier. A number of senior leaders had been let go as part of the process. The company had lost clients faster than it could recover from, and the board had eventually stepped in to take control. Yvonne had been one of the executives who didn't survive it. I thanked HR and put the phone down slowly. The HR coordinator asked, gently, whether I wanted Yvonne removed from the interview list given our shared history. I understood why she was asking. It was thoughtful of her to offer. And for just a moment, I genuinely considered it, not to protect myself, but because I wanted to be honest with myself about my own motivations before I made any decision. Was I keeping her on the list because it was fair? Or was I keeping her on the list for reasons that had nothing to do with fairness at all? I sat with that question long enough to find the true answer. Then I shook my head and told HR to keep her on the list. She deserves to be evaluated the same way as everyone else, I said. That's what we do here. I meant it. Interview day came on a gray Thursday morning. I had back-to-back candidate meetings scheduled across the day, and I had reviewed every file carefully the night before. I arrived early, made coffee, and went through my notes the way I always did before important decisions. About 30 minutes before Yvonne's slot, I walked through the corridor past the waiting area and looked through the glass panel in the door. She was seated near the window, legs crossed, reviewing what looked like a printed set of her own notes. Her posture was composed. Her clothes were professional. She had the look of someone who had been through many interviews before and fully expected to perform well in this one. She had absolutely no idea who she was about to walk in and meet. I watched her for a few quiet seconds. She didn't look up. I went back to my office and waited. When Yvonne walked into the conference room and looked up from the doorway, she stopped so completely it looked like someone had cut the power to her legs. The color left her face. Her chin lifted. Her eyes moved from me to the nameplate in front of my chair, then back to my face, as though she needed both pieces of information before her mind would accept what it was seeing. I stood up, smiled, and extended my hand. Yvonne, I said. Good to see you. Please, sit down. She crossed the room and sat across from me. Her handshake was steady. I noticed that. She pulled her expression back into something professional, something composed, which took real effort given what was clearly happening inside her. We exchanged a few opening words. The room felt close, like the air had shifted just slightly. Then we began. For the first half of the interview, we covered standard ground. I asked about her operational experience, her approach to managing teams under pressure, how she handled underperforming staff. She answered clearly and with genuine substance. She was not without real skill, and I was not going to pretend otherwise just because of our history. I gave every answer the same attention I gave every other candidate that day. Then I reached the question I had written the night before. The one I had thought through slowly and deliberately before deciding to include it. I looked at her steadily and asked, in your experience, why do talented employees leave strong departments? What patterns have you seen, and what did you do to address them? There was a pause. About 4 seconds, which is a long time inside a quiet room. She began constructing an answer about organizational challenges and communication breakdowns. I reached for the folder in front of me. I slid the folder across the table without rushing. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a compiled summary of exit interview reports from her former department, the same department I had once spent 6 years in. 2 of the names in those reports I recognized immediately. Several of the stated reasons for leaving felt very familiar for a different reason entirely. The second document showed a pattern of informal concerns logged with HR about specific employees who had later been passed over for promotion or had quietly resigned. The concerns were always described in vague terms, always communicated verbally, always traced back to Yvonne. The third was a formal complaint filed by a former staff member, quietly settled and closed years ago without ever becoming public. I watched her eyes move across the pages. She didn't speak. When she looked up, the composed expression was still there, but it had gone thin. "I want to be straightforward with you," I said. "This interview has been real. Your experience is real. I'm not here to humiliate you or settle anything old." She held my eyes without looking away. "But this role requires someone who builds people up," I said. "Someone who sees ability in the people around them and creates space for it to grow. Not someone who manages their own comfort by keeping others small." The room was completely quiet. Yvonne didn't try to argue. She didn't reach for a polished explanation. I think she understood, perhaps for the first time without any escape route available, exactly what she had done over all those years. Not in the dramatic way of a public confrontation. In the quiet, unavoidable way of sitting across from the evidence of it with nowhere left to redirect the conversation. She had spent years making sure I never reached this seat. And here she was, sitting across from it, needing something from me. I thanked her for coming in. I told her HR would be in contact with all candidates at the close of the process. She stood, nodded once, and walked out. I stayed in the conference room for a few minutes after the door closed. The folder sat open on the table. The city moved quietly through the window. The building hummed around me the way buildings do when everything is still. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel the hot satisfaction I might have expected to feel in that moment. What I felt was something quieter and more permanent, like a weight I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten it was there had finally, gently, been set down. Yvonne had believed that leadership was about control, about deciding who got to move forward and who didn't, about using careful, private language to reshape someone else's future without ever leaving a mark. She never understood that real leadership is the exact opposite of that. I closed the folder, turned off the light, and went back to work. The best response I ever gave her wasn't anything I said in that room. It was everything I had already built, without her permission, without her approval, and completely beyond her reach.